You're seeing all these flashy headlines about insane camera upgrades coming to the iPhone 18 Pro and iPhone 18 Pro Max. Variable apertures, huge telephoto improvements, even a teleconverter and a foldable iPhone launching alongside them. Let's slow down in this video. I want to push back on these leaks and explain why a lot of this might be overhyped, misinterpreted, or simply not realistic for Apple's actual 2026 iPhone lineup, because Apple is testing something in a lab doesn't mean it's ever going to ship in a real iPhone. Let's break this down piece by piece. First, the latest leak claims Apple is actively testing a brand new main camera with variable aperture for a future iPhone, most likely iPhone 18 Pro and iPhone 18 Pro Max. On paper, variable aperture sounds amazing. You can mechanically open or close the lens to control how much light hits the sensor. In dark scenes, the lens opens wider to pull in more light. In bright scenes, it closes down to avoid overexposure. It also gives you hardware control over depth of field, how blurry or sharp your background looks compared to your subject. Sounds like a dream upgrade for mobile photographers, right? Here's the problem. This exact idea has already been tried in smartphones and quietly abandoned. Samsung did it years ago with the Galaxy S9 and Galaxy S10. They used a variable aperture system that could switch between two f-stops. It was a cool party trick for marketing, but it came with serious trade-offs. Added thickness, mechanical complexity, higher cost, and not enough real-world benefit to justify those downsides. What did Samsung do? They killed the feature in 2020 and never looked back. So ask yourself, why would Apple, a company obsessed with thinness, reliability, and clean internal design, suddenly embrace a mechanical system that their biggest rival dropped years ago? Yes, multiple reports, like the one citing Ming-Chi, Kuo, and other supply chain sources say Apple is planning or testing a variable aperture system for the iPhone 18 Pro lineup. But this is exactly the kind of feature that often shows up in prototypes and never makes it to mass production. Apple experiments with a lot of hardware ideas in their labs. Most of them never leave the building. And in Apple's case, variable aperture goes directly against the way they've been improving iPhone cameras for the last decade, through computational photography, not moving parts. Right now, the main cameras on the iPhone 14 Pro through iPhone 17 Pro all use a fixed aperture of f1.78. The lens is always wide open. And Apple does everything else with software smart HDR, deep fusion, night mode, multi-frame blending, machine learning, and simulated depth of field in portrait mode. They've built an entire ecosystem around the idea that the hardware stays simple and predictable, while the software does the magic. Do they really want to throw a mechanical variable aperture into that equation, complicate the lens stack, increase failure points, and make the camera module thicker, just to get a marginal benefit in a few niche shooting scenarios? It's possible, but it's far from guaranteed. Another red flag. Enthusiasts are acting like variable aperture would suddenly turn the iPhone into a full-frame camera. It won't. You're still dealing with a tiny smartphone sensor and extremely short focal lengths. The difference in real optical bokeh between, say, f1.6 and f2.4 on a phone sensor is subtle compared to what you can already fake with Apple's portrait mode and subject separation algorithms. So yes, Apple might be testing variable aperture, but tests don't equal product. And given Apple's history, this feels more like a prototype experiment than a lock-in feature for the iPhone 18 Pro camera. Now let's move to the second part of these leaks, the supposedly upgraded telephoto camera with a larger aperture. On the iPhone 18 Pro. Right now, the iPhone 17 Pro models use a telephoto lens with an f2.8 aperture. Apple did give that telephoto a big sensor upgrade from 12 megapixels to 48 megapixels, but they kept the same f2.8 aperture size. The leak says Apple is now testing a telephoto with a larger aperture. which would mean better light gathering ability, reduced noise and low light, faster shutter speeds, slightly stronger background separation. All of that sounds good. But again, we need to talk about physics to make the aperture larger in a meaningful way. On a telephoto lens, you need more glass and more space. That typically means a bigger camera bump. Apple already gets roasted every year for the size of the camera island. The modules are getting fatter, the rings are larger, and the whole phone rocks on a table because of that bump. Are they really going to push it even further out for a modest telephoto gain that 90% of users won't even notice in casual shooting? Apple's priority is not just camera quality, it's overall industrial design, device thickness, weight, and cost. Every extra millimeter on that telephoto module has to be justified. And remember, Apple already made a big move with the telephoto in recent generations by jumping to 48 megapixels and extended zoom reach on the Pro models. Most mainstream users already see that as good enough. If Apple wants better zoom performance, they can lean on sensor cropping, AI upscaling, and multi-frame processing instead of re-engineering the optics. Will they try a slightly larger telephoto aperture in testing? Sure. Will that necessarily end up in the final iPhone 18 Pro Max? Not so sure. The leak also repeats another bold claim. Apple is supposedly working on a teleconverter for the iPhone 18 Pro line to increase effective focal length and further improve zoom range. If you've used real cameras, you know what a teleconverter does. It sits between the lens and the sensor and multiplies the effective focal length. For example, turning a 100mm lens into a 200mm equivalent. But that zoom comes at a cost. Teleconverters typically reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor, degrade sharpness and contrast, add more glass and more bulk to the optical path on a DSLR or mirrorless camera. That trade-off can make sense if you really need the reach. On a smartphone, which is already fighting extreme size and thickness constraints, building in a true optical teleconverter is an engineering nightmare. Again, this could easily be something Apple is experimenting with in early prototypes. That doesn't mean you should expect a physical teleconverter system in a mass market iPhone. What's much more realistic is that people are confusing the idea of a teleconverter with advanced digital zoom, things like multi-frame super resolution, AI scaling, sensor cropping, and clever periscope optics that simulate longer focal lengths. Without a separate converter element, Apple will definitely keep pushing zoom forward. But a classic optical teleconverter inside a 7 to 8 millimeters thin smartphone, that deserves a lot of skepticism. Next, let's touch on the rumored 24 megapixel front-facing camera for the iPhone 18 Pro models. This is probably the most believable part of these leaks, but also one of the least exciting. Apple has slowly been improving the front camera over the years and moving from a 12 megapixel to a higher resolution 24 megapixel sensor at some point is almost inevitable. It would help with sharper selfies, higher quality FaceTime calls, and cleaner cropping for social media content. But this isn't some game-changing, revolutionary upgrade. This is just a normal evolution. And more importantly, a bump in resolution doesn't automatically mean better image quality. If the sensor size doesn't increase proportionally, you end up with smaller pixels, which can hurt low-light performance. Then Apple has to rely even more heavily on multi-frame computational processing to clean things up. So yes, a 24 megapixel front camera could happen on the iPhone 18 Pro, but it's not the headline feature people are making it out to be, and it definitely doesn't prove that all the other wilder camera leaks are legit. Finally, we have the big dramatic claim. The iPhone 18 Pro lineup will launch in the fall, alongside Apple's first foldable iPhone. This is where the leaks really start to stretch credibility. A foldable iPhone is almost certainly coming one day. Apple has been filing patents for foldable displays, hinge systems, and flexible components for years. They're absolutely exploring it, but launching a foldable iPhone in the same window as the iPhone 18 Pro and iPhone 18 Pro Max raises some serious questions. Apple doesn't like to cannibalize its own flagship at launch. Dropping a foldable iPhone next to the regular Pro line would split marketing, split supply, and split attention.